The tunnel was supposed to be a quick in and out. Just a rookie handler proving he could keep his head in the dark. Just a young K9 proving she could track clean without letting the mind's hush get into her bones. But confidence was a thin jacket in a place that breathed cold. Their headlamps carved shaky cones along wet rock veined with rust, past timber braces swollen and black, over puddles that quivered every time a drip struck like a clock far away. The dog moved first, shoulder low, nose working, nails clicking softly on stone. And the handler followed with one hand on her vest, the other on the lead, repeating the same calm words he'd practiced 100 times in daylight. Then the air changed. Not a gust, not a draft. More like the tunnel swallowed sound, packed it down, and returned it as pressure in his ears. The dog's head snapped up. Her tail, which had been flagging with purpose, tucked tight. She stopped so hard the handler nearly stepped over her. And in the beam of his lamp, her eyes were wide and fixed on a slice of darkness ahead where their light didn't seem to reach. He whispered her name, tried to laugh it off, tried to tell himself it was bats or an old collapse shifting. But she didn't blink. She listened. He listened too, and heard something that wasn't water and wasn't wind. A faint scuff, like boot rubber on grit, followed by a delicate metallic kiss, as if someone had tapped a carabiner against stone on purpose. A warning disguised as an accident. The handler's throat went dry. Radio check, only static. He took one step closer, raising his light, and the beam caught a line on the ground that hadn't been there a moment ago. Freshly disturbed dust, dragged in a careful arc, as if something heavy had been pulled across the floor to erase their path. The dog let out a low, single note. Not a bark, not a whine, a sound like an engine trying to start, with her body angled between him and that tunnel. He didn't have time to fully understand it before the mine answered. Farther in, deeper than the drip line, a sharp crack snapped through the dark, close enough to feel, and the timbers above them shuddered, sending a sprinkle of grit onto his helmet. Another crack, closer. The dog surged backward, pulling him with her, and the handler finally felt what she'd felt first. Not fear, but intent. The unmistakable sensation that someone down here had touched the mine like a switch. It wasn't random. It was a message. He pivoted, boots splashing, lamp bouncing, and the tunnel behind them, where they'd come from, looked wrong, as if the shadows had rearranged themselves. He didn't negotiate with pride or protocol. He ran. The dog ran beside him, lead taut, breath sawing, and somewhere behind, in the collapsing quiet, a light flared once and died, like an eye closing, and daylight felt impossible. Fluorescent light turned the station into a clean aquarium, everything pale and humming, the kind of brightness that made even burnt coffee look honest. The rookie handler sat at a metal desk with a stack of forms that smelled like toner and disinfectant, pen moving in careful strokes while his knee bounced a quiet confession under the table. He wasn't afraid of work. He was afraid of missing something small. Across from him, his K9 partner lay on a rubber mat, chin on paws, ears twitching at every radio squawk and distant door click, her whole body tuned like an instrument waiting for the first note. She was young but not sloppy, eyes bright, muscles ready, loyalty already welded into her bones. And the handler kept stealing glances at her the way people check a compass when they don't trust the weather. He was new to being the one in charge, new to the weight of saying search and meaning risk, new to reading the subtle alphabet of her tells, the way her nostrils flared when a scent turned interesting, the tiny shift in her shoulders when curiosity hardened into caution. His training officer had told him, half advice and half warning, "Your dog will speak first. The question is whether you'll listen before you're forced to. That line kept replaying in his head as he signed off on inventory and logged routine patrol notes, trying to look like someone who'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. Outside the front windows, the morning was gray and slow. Rain threatening but undecided, and the flag out front hung limp like it was tired. The calm felt earned, almost sacred, until the dispatcher's voice cut through it. Sharp, clipped, carrying that particular edge that meant the day had just turned. "Unit available for a check near the old mine road," she said, and the handler's pen paused mid-stroke. Multiple calls from locals, reports of lights at the entrance after dark, and voices. Not kids messing around, according to them. They're saying it doesn't match the wind. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone muted a laugh that didn't land. And even the dog lifted her head, like the words had a scent. The handler tried to keep his face neutral as he pushed back from the desk. But his stomach tightened anyway. Because the mine wasn't just a location on a map. It was the kind of place that lived in town stories. The kind of place parents used as a warning, and teenagers used as a dare. "Copy," he said into the radio, voice steady on the surface, and he reached for the leash with hands that felt too warm. The dog sprang up immediately, tail thumping once, eyes fixed on him with pure, uncomplicated readiness, as if every boring hour had been rehearsing for this exact moment. He clipped on her vest, checked the buckle twice, and she stood perfectly still for him, only the quiver of anticipation betraying her. Around them, the station's routine kept moving. Paper shuffling, boots on tile, a printer spitting out another sheet. But the handler felt a thin line snap inside his chest, the line between training and real. He looked down at his partner and made a private promise in the bright, artificial light. Whatever that mine was hiding, he would not ask her to step into it alone. Today would test them in full. The mine road twisted out of town like a thought you shouldn't follow, climbing through scrub and pines until the air cooled and the world narrowed to wet asphalt and fog that clung to the windshield in slow, deliberate sheets. By the time the handler killed the engine, the silence felt thicker than it should have been. The kind that made you listen to your own breathing too loudly. The hillside loomed ahead, dark green and black rock stitched together. And in the middle of it, the mine entrance waited. An uneven cut that looked less like a doorway and more like a mouth that had learned how to stay perfectly still. Rusted fencing sagged around it in defeated angles, as if even metal had tried to leave and failed. And the warning signs were sun-bleached and pocked with BB dents. Keep out, danger, unsafe structure. Words that had been shouted so long they'd turned into background noise. Rain had just passed through. The ground was slick and packed, and the smell hit him the moment he stepped out. What? Wet stone, iron, and something faintly sour underneath, like water that had been trapped too long without moving. His boots sank slightly into mud as he opened the rear door for his K9. And she launched out with a sharp intake of air, nostrils flaring, body already angled toward the mine, as if an invisible thread had been tied to her chest. He reached for the leash, spoke her name, tried to settle the tempo with the calm, practiced cadence from training. But she was reading a language he couldn't see yet, her ears pivoting, her gaze flicking over the entrance and the tree line beyond. The place did feel wrong, not in a supernatural way, not in a movie way, but in a practical, physical way. Like arriving at a scene after the argument is over and realizing the furniture has been moved. He walked toward the fence line, letting his light sweep the ground on instinct, and that's when he saw it. Footprints. Fresh. Clear impressions pressed into the soft mud where no one should be walking. the tread pattern crisp enough to count the grooves, leading from the overgrown path toward the mouth of the mine. Not old prints softened by wind and rain. These were recent, sharp-edged, urgent. His stomach tightened as he followed them with his eyes. And there, beside them, a thin line sliced through the dirt like a dragged finger. A narrow groove that started near the fence and disappeared into the darkness of the entrance, as if something heavy had been pulled inward in a straight, patient effort. He crouched, touched the mud with a gloved hand, and it came away wet and cold, confirming what his gut already knew. This happened after the last rain, not weeks ago. The dog made a soft sound in her throat, not a bark, but a tight, vibrating note of concentration, and before he could finish the full command, before he could form the words that made it official, she dropped her nose to the ground and began tracking, pulling gently but insistently toward the prints. Posture forward, tail steady, every step purposeful. "Easy," he murmured, tightening his grip on the lead, trying to slow her into a controlled search instead of a headlong rush. But she wasn't rushing. She was certain. The handler glanced back toward the road for a moment, half expecting to see a local watching from the trees or a vehicle tucked behind the bend, and saw only mist and dripping branches pretending to be innocent. When he turned back, the dog was already at the threshold, nose hovering just above the dragged line, breathing shallow and rapid as if the air itself carried information. The mine exhaled cold into her face. She didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the dark like it was calling her by name. And the handler, with duty in his chest and unease crawling up his spine, followed her into the mouth. Inside the threshold, daylight didn't fade so much as it got confiscated, and the mine replaced the outside world with cold air that tasted like iron left out in rain. The handler clicked his headlamp brighter, and its beam carved a thin corridor through damp rock glazed with mineral sweat, timber braces bowed by age, and puddles that held the light like black glass. For the first stretch, if the dog moved in her familiar working rhythm, nose low, tail steady, paws careful, following the dragged groove and boot prints like she was reading ink on a page. And the handler stayed close behind, voice calm, feeding her soft cues the way he'd been taught, trying to sound like someone who belonged in the dark. He told himself the tightness in his chest was just the place doing what it always did to people, making them aware of weight above their heads and emptiness ahead of their feet. Then the dog changed, sudden and complete. Her tail sank low. Her nose lifted off the ground and hovered higher, tasting the air instead of reading the floor. She slowed, shoulders tightening, ears tipping forward, as if scent had become secondary and sound had become law. The handler felt his confidence wobble and tried to rationalize it fast, the way rookies do to stay functional. Bats shifting in pockets of rock, stale air rolling out of deeper chambers, an old brace creaking under pressure. Mines made noises. Everyone knew that. He swept his light up to the ceiling line, scanning for loose rock and splintered supports, and for a moment, he almost convinced himself he was being dramatic. But the dog didn't look up. She angled left, pulling him toward a narrow side tunnel he hadn't clocked from the entrance, a slit in stone framed by rotten timbers like ribs. Cold breathed out of it, cleaner somehow, as if it had been sealed away from the main shaft. The handler shortened the leash and reached for his radio to call in the deviation. But the speaker answered with thin static, a hiss that sounded like distance and wet sand. He changed channels, checked the battery, tried again. More hiss, no voice, no reassuring acknowledgement from the surface. The dog tugged once more, not frantic, just certain. And that certainty bothered him more than panic ever could, because it meant she wasn't guessing. He stepped closer and let the headlamp spill into the side tunnel, and the beam caught a smear of fresh mud on the wall, too high to be a footprint, like a shoulder or a dragged object had brushed past. It was wet-edged, new, not the dry stain of years. He swallowed, tried to tell himself it was a careless trespasser, but his body didn't believe it. The silence ahead was gathering, pressing down until even the drip of water sounded far away, like it was happening in another mine. And then the dog stopped. Not a pause, not a hesitation. A full stop, rigid as a statue. One front paw lifted and hung in the air. Her stare locked into the darkness, like she'd recognized something she wasn't supposed to see. The handler followed her gaze and saw nothing at all. Yet his heart accelerated as if it had. And in that moment, he understood her new posture with a clarity that made his skin prickle. She wasn't searching anymore. She was warning him. He eased them back toward the mouth of the mine, step by step, not fleeing, just refusing to stand blind in that side tunnel with the dog turned to stone. As the gray daylight seeped in, the pressure in his ears loosened and outside noise returned. The tick of rain off pine needles, gravel shifting under a boot, a low murmur like people arguing from a distance. He thumbed his radio again, changing channels, lifting it high as if signal lived closer to the sky. But it only answered with static. That's when he realized they weren't alone up here either. A man stood near the sagging fence line in a clean jacket that didn't match the mud, hands in his pockets like he owned the silence, face arranged into polite concern. "Officer Wright?" he called, voice smooth, almost friendly. "You don't want to be going in there. That's not a job for, not without proper crews." He smiled when he said it, the way people smile when they're trying to move you without touching you. The handler kept his stance neutral, leash secure, eyes flicking past the man to the cluster of locals gathered farther back by the trees. Half a dozen shapes, hoods up, arms crossed, watching like they'd been waiting for someone official to show up so they could stand near fear without admitting it. They whispered in broken pieces, their words carried by the damp air. "I told you, and last week again, and did you see the lights?" The dog's ears tracked those whispers, but her eyes kept sliding toward the mine mouth as if the darkness was speaking louder than any person. The helpful man stepped a little closer, still casual, still careful not to look like a barrier. "Property's a mess of liability," he continued. "Owner's supposed to handle it, or the county. You don't want to get yourself hurt over teenagers playing games." The handler heard the emphasis, yourself, as if the concern was personal, as if he were being protected. It didn't feel like protection. It felt like someone offering him an easy exit before he asked the wrong questions. He glanced down at the ground and saw it again, right there beside the fence. The fresh boot prints, the dragged line disappearing into the mouth, proof that whatever this was, it wasn't just rumor. The locals shifted, the group tightening and loosening like a nervous animal, and one older woman, hair tucked under a cap, eyes sharp with the kind of knowledge that comes from living near something too long, finally lifted her chin and said it out loud, clear enough to cut through the murmurs. "People go in there," she said, "and they don't come out the same." A hush followed, heavy and immediate, as if even the helpful man had been waiting for that sentence to be spoken so it could hang over the handler's head like a sign. The handler's heartbeat thudded against his ribs. Superstition wanted to take the wheel, to call it off, to pretend the static radio meant the universe had drawn a line. But duty pushed harder than superstition. He was here because someone called for help, because rules existed for reasons, because his partner's nose was telling him there was truth in that mud. He met the helpful man's eyes and kept his voice steady. "I appreciate the concern," he said, adjusting his grip on the leash. "But we're here now. We check it." The dog shifted closer to the threshold, eager and uneasy at once, and the locals watched like a chorus, praying not to be proven right. And the mine waited, mouth open, breathing cold. And she leaned into him, steady. He went back in like he was entering a courtroom, not a cave. Slow, deliberate, every move recorded in his mind for later. Because the dark loved nothing more than a story that couldn't be proven. At the threshold, he snapped chalk and drew a clean white slash on the right-hand timber. Then another on the rock beside it, a breadcrumb that said, "This way out." "Unit checking the mine," he said into his radio. Static answered, but he logged the attempt anyway, thumb tapping the casing as if persistence could turn noise into signal. The dog moved ahead at a controlled pull, and he let her lead without letting her run, counting steps, placing boots where the ground looked firm, keeping his shoulders squared so panic couldn't borrow his posture. Light sweep, left wall, right wall, ceiling line, floor, light sweep again. His gloved hand slid along the rock at shoulder height, feeling slick mineral skin, tracing cracks and old chisel marks, noting where timbers bowed under pressure and where the stone wept, rusty water that smelled like pennies. A puddle widened across the tunnel, and the dog's paws went through it with quiet splashes, ripples spreading in perfect circles that trembled around the reflected cone of his lamp. He marked the wall with chalk again at a fork. 2 slashes now, a simple code for "return this way." And he forced himself to breathe through his nose, slow, because breathing fast turned stale air into a threat. Each time the tunnel dipped or tightened, he stopped and listened. Drip, drip, distance settling, nothing that sounded like a human. He tried the radio again. Static. He told himself it was rock and depth and bad luck, not sabotage. Because naming sabotage would make him look over his shoulder every second, and he couldn't afford to lose forward focus. The dog paused at a seam in the wall, nose lifting, nostrils fluttering, listening more than smelling. And he followed her attention with another careful sweep of the beam. The air carried dust in thin threads, but one thread behaved wrong, curling and streaming sideways like it had purpose. He crouched, watching it, waiting for the draft to explain itself, and it didn't. The dust drifted as if nudged by movement he couldn't see. He tightened his grip on the leash, whispered a cue to keep her close, and stepped toward where the tunnel's shadow thickened around a low rock shelf. He felt his heart thump once, hard, when the light revealed what didn't belong in a place that was supposed to be dead. A length of tape stuck to stone, clean and fresh, and a handful of zip ties scattered like pale bones. He reached in with his glove, and the tape tugged back with sticky resistance, new enough to still fight. Beside it, half buried in grit, a candy wrapper flashed bright against the mud. Crisp, recent, crinkling when he touched it. Evidence wasn't dramatic. It was mundane, modern, unmistakable. The mine wasn't abandoned. It was being used. Then a ribbon of dust, so fine it looked like smoke, slid sideways across his beam, moving against the draft, like someone had just passed. The dog's ears snapped forward. He followed it and found, behind a rock shelf, plastic zip ties and fresh tape, edges still sticky, plus a candy wrapper under his glove. Not abandoned, not close. The realization hit not in a flash, but in a slow, creeping shift. The kind you feel in your spine before your mind catches up. Because just as he pocketed the wrapper and tightened his grip on the leash, a metallic clatter tremored through the tunnel behind them, sharp enough to slice through the steady drip of water, wrong enough to turn the dog's head so fast her collar jingled in the dark. It wasn't the groan of old timbers or falling debris. It was the deliberate jolt of metal meeting metal, as if a chain had been tugged or a tool kicked on purpose. He froze, pulse hammering in the hollow of his throat, and swept his light backward along the path they had walked, comparing it to the map in his memory, and suddenly things didn't match. The guide rope he'd noted earlier, the frayed length that had been coiled harmlessly along the wall, now arced across the floor like a trip line. The chalk mark he'd drawn at the last junction wasn't where he'd left it, smeared downward like a thumb had dragged through it. And farther back, at the very edge of his beam, the gate of bent chicken wire that had been open on their way in now hung half shut, sagging inward as if nudged by a hand that didn't want to be seen. Not random, coordinated. Someone had moved pieces behind them like they were pawns in a game they didn't know they were playing. The dog let out a single low whine that vibrated up the leash, a sound he'd heard only once during training, a deep, reluctant alarm, the sound she made when instinct shouted, "Flee," even while obedience whispered, "Stay." His mouth went dry. He turned slowly, not wanting to give away panic to the unseen watcher, and walked back toward the gate with precise, measured steps. Every footfall placed like he was working a crime scene instead of a maze someone was actively reshaping. His beam skimmed over rocks, puddles, chalk, rope, all of it familiar yet wrong, like someone had rearranged details just enough to make memory unreliable. "Who's down here?" he called, voice steady but too loud in the suffocating dark. No answer. Only the echo of his own voice bouncing off tunnels that swallowed the rest. He clicked his radio again, static, no voices, no guidance. The mind held its breath as if waiting to see what he'd do next. The dog pressed close to his leg, body taut, head turned not toward the deeper tunnel, but toward the way out, toward the darkness that should have been empty, but now felt occupied. Watched, measured. The handler crouched beside the rope on the ground and touched it, still vibrating faintly, as though it had been moved seconds before they heard the metal shift. A chill crawled up his neck. Whoever was down here didn't want to confront them. They wanted them confused, penned in, turned around. They wanted control of the map. And suddenly the handler understood with absolute clarity. This wasn't trespassing or urban exploration or even a panicked squatter. Someone else was inside the mine, and they knew exactly where the rookies were standing. The mine wasn't abandoned. It was occupied, and the occupant was playing with them. He refused to back out blind, because backing out blind was exactly what the unseen hands wanted. So he turned the other direction and pushed deeper, keeping the dog tight to his left leg like a living compass. He laid a fresh chalk mark, 3 quick slashes, then advanced in a careful rhythm. Light sweep, boot placement, listen, repeat. The tunnel opened after a bend, the ceiling lifting into a wider chamber where the air felt colder but cleaner, as if it had been traded recently. His beam slid across the floor and caught the first proof of occupation. Flattened sleeping roll pushed against the wall, dark with damp but not rotted, positioned the way someone places a bed when they expect to return. Next to it, scattered tools glinted. An intact flashlight, a wrench, a coil of cord. And beside those, a plastic bottle half full of water, label still bright. Modern. Recent. The dog's nose worked fast, not just tracking but checking, and then her hackles rose in one sharp wave, a bristle line that turned her into a warning sign. The handler's stomach tightened. He swept his light higher and saw tape again, new and aggressively sticky, stretched between 2 timbers in a crude lattice like someone had tried to section off part of the chamber. Zip ties cinched it all together, white and clean against black wood. Containment. Not the casual mess of teenagers, not the chaos of a drifter. This was deliberate, constructed, maintained. He stepped closer and the dog leaned forward with him, body tense, soundless except for a faint woof of breath. On the ground, dragged shapes marked the grit, long, shallow impressions with rounded ends, as if bundles had been pulled and pivoted, over and over. He crouched, gloved fingers hovering above one groove. Then he noticed the darker stains along its edges, where wet dirt had been compressed recently, still holding the clean outline of weight. His mind offered excuses out of habit: equipment, sacks, scrap. But each excuse collapsed under the details. The way the grooves led toward the taped barrier, the way they stopped there, the way the barrier blocked sight into a narrower cut in the rock beyond. He angled his headlamp through the taped gaps, and the light fell on something that made his throat go tight. More tape, more cord, and a section of metal mesh like a cage wall that had been bolted to stone. Whoever built this hadn't been trying to keep people out. They'd been trying to keep something in, or keep something hidden from anyone walking past. The dog let out a low, vibrating growl that barely carried. The kind that said she smelled fear layered with human intention, and his own skin prickled as if the chamber had just turned to look at him. He tried the radio again, reflex more than hope, and got only static and a thin click like distant interference. The old woman's words outside echoed in his head, "Don't come out the same." And suddenly the lights and voices made sense in a way that wasn't folklore at all. People down here weren't just trespassing, they were operating, hiding, managing a secret with walls and tape and dragged bundles. He swallowed, forced himself to stand, and realized with a cold clarity that this call had never been about strange noises in the wind. It had been about something buried in the dark that someone would do anything to keep buried. Somewhere above, water counted time on stone alone. The chamber felt bigger only because it gave the dark more room to press in, and as soon as he stepped away from the crude barrier, his lungs reminded him where he was. Each breath a little shallower, each inhale tasting of wet stone and something chemical that didn't belong in a dead place. He tried the radio again, forcing calm into his voice for the record that no one could hear. And the speaker answered with a crackle of dead space so complete it sounded like a channel tuned to absence. Then his headlamp stuttered. Once. Twice. A quick, sickly flutter that made the beam wobble and smear across the walls like a heartbeat on a monitor. He tapped the side, checked the battery pack, told himself it was damp contact or nerves. But the dog's ears pinned back as if she felt it too, as if the light's weakness was a signal to whatever was watching. Her nose swept the air, fast and urgent, and suddenly she lunged toward a narrow passage beyond the barrier, a slit in rock that looked like a throat. The handler tightened the leash, stumbling a half step as she pulled, and for a split second he thought she'd found the way out, or the person. But she snapped back so hard it yanked his arm, claws scrabbling for traction, refusing to go another inch forward. She planted herself, rigid, a living wall of no, her eyes wide and fixed on that passage, as if something inside it had spoken directly into her instincts. Invisible wall, not physical, primal. The handler's mouth went dry. He raised his light again, and it flickered, and in the same moment, a new sound threaded through the chamber. Footsteps. Not the settling pop of timber or the drip of water. Footsteps, measured, close. A murmur followed, low human voices clipped into short phrases that didn't echo like his had, as if the speakers knew exactly where to stand to keep sound from carrying. He felt the dog's hackles lift higher. He pivoted, trying to find the source, but the headlamp chose that moment to dim and flare again, and a separate beam of light cut across the chamber from the tunnel mouth, clean, bright, intentional, sweeping like a searchlight until it landed near his boots. they'd found him. The handler didn't wait for a greeting or a warning. He made a split decision that didn't feel like bravery so much as arithmetic. Protect the dog. Protect the evidence. Get out now. He shoved the wrapper and a handful of zip ties deeper into his pocket, yanked the leash short, and moved, fast but controlled, toward the route back, the one with his chalk marks, the one he'd trusted until someone started rearranging the path behind them. K9 unit, identify yourself. A voice snapped from the dark, and the beam flicked toward his chest. Another step and his lamp flickered again, like it was answering their light with surrender. He didn't answer. Answers invited conversation, and conversation bought time for traps. He ran. The dog ran beside him, low and tight, paws splashing through puddles, breath coming in sharp bursts. The tunnel narrowed into a choke point, where the ceiling dropped and jagged rock scraped his shoulder, forcing him to duck, and the air grew thinner with every turn, stale and heavy like the mine was tightening its grip. Behind them, the pursuing steps accelerated, and multiple beams began to dance off the walls, slicing past his chalk marks as if they were laughing at his preparations. Left turn, he took it. Low ceiling, he crouched. Loose rock, he kicked it aside, praying it wouldn't roll underfoot. The dog hesitated at a fork, nose darting, then chose, and he trusted her because he had no map that mattered anymore. But the deeper they went, the more he felt it. They weren't simply being chased. They were being herded, guided by sound and light and altered markers toward a place where the mind would do the rest. Somewhere behind, a metal gate slammed, and the echo chased them like a closing door on daylight. Daylight hit him like a wave, harsh and holy after the mind's dim chokehold, and he and the dog burst out of the mouth together in a spray of mud and breath. Boots skidding on wet gravel as cold air became open air, as the ceiling vanished and the sky, gray, enormous, returned like a promise that hadn't been broken. He stumbled 2 steps away from the entrance, chest heaving, headlamp still twitching in weak little pulses, and the dog snapped into position the instant they cleared the threshold, planting herself between him and the dark, with her feet wide and her body low. A living barricade. Her growl rolled out steady and deep, not wild, not panicked, but certain. The kind of warning that didn't end just because you'd reached the surface. She stared into that black cut in the hillside like it was staring back, like something inside had followed them to the edge and simply stopped where the light began. The handler fumbled for his radio with shaking hands, lifted it high and turned, and this time it caught. First a crackle, then a voice. "Unit, say again. Repeat your last." Relief hit so hard it almost knocked him down. "We need backup," he rasped, forcing words through air-starved lungs. "Possible active occupants inside, evidence of containment, I repeat. Containment. We were pursued. Lock this down." He heard the shift on the other end immediately, the calm hardening into action. "Copy. Units en route, hold position." The locals, who had hovered like silhouettes earlier, stepped back farther now, faces pale, the Greek chorus suddenly quiet, as if the mind's secret had moved from rumor to reality right in front of them. The helpful man stood near the fence line with his polite mask slipping, eyes darting toward the trees as if calculating exits. And the handler, mud streaked up his pants, hands scraped, evidence heavy in his pocket, caught that flicker and stored it away like another clue. Sirens arrived in the distance, faint at first, then louder as vehicles climbed the mine road, tires hissing on wet pavement, doors slamming, boots hitting ground. Radios talking to radios like a net being thrown. Within minutes, the entrance was framed by uniforms and flashlights. Tape going up fast, perimeter established. The place transforming in real time from a creepy curiosity into a crime scene with boundaries and witnesses and consequences. Someone set up floodlights that bleached the hillside, and in that white glare the mine looked smaller, less mythical, but no less dangerous. Just exposed. The dog didn't relax. Even with backup crowding in, even with voices and engines and metal clinking, she kept her stance, growling once more under her breath at the dark, as if to remind everyone that the threat didn't need to show its face to be real. Only when another handler approached and spoke softly to her did she shift, leaning back toward her rookie partner, pressing her shoulder into his knee with a quick, grounding weight that told him she was still with him. Later, after statements, after evidence bags, after the first wave of adrenaline drained out and left him hollow, he sat on the tailgate of the unit with the dog between his boots, rain misting the air so fine it felt like breath from the sky. He rested his forehead against her fur, warm and damp and alive, and he listened to her breathing until his own slowed to match it. In that quiet, the lesson landed with clean certainty. Rookies don't survive because they're fearless. They survive because they learn when to listen. Listen to training. Listen to the moment. Listen to the partner who can smell danger before it becomes visible. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is run, not from fear, but from a warning.